Hi, Gabby. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep, I can hear you too.
Oh, okay, great. I just need to rearrange my screen here. Oh, okay.
Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our panel on policing and public safety, hosted by the Division of Epidemiology and Community Health's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Action Team. This panel is the beginning of an important and necessary conversation. This panel is an hour long, and we will try to cover as much as we can. There will be time for audience questions. We just ask that we remain respectful and considerate of our shared time. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Jaime Slaughter-Acey, a faculty in our division, and our moderator for this morning. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank everybody for coming to this important panel. And I want to, before we jump into questions of the day, or deep dive into conversation, I want to introduce our wonderful speakers who've agreed to share their time with us. First, we have Dr. SooJin Pate, who volunteers with MPD150, which is a participatory, horizontally organized effort by local organizers, researchers, artists, and activists to shift the discussion around police and policing in Minneapolis from one of procedural reform to one of meaningful structural change. And we'll be discussing what does that actually mean? And then our other panelist is Corenia Smith, who is from the Reclaim the Block, which began in 2018 and organizes a Minneapolis community and city council members to move money from the police department into areas of the city's budget that truly promote community health and safety. And again, we'll be exploring what does that truly mean? What does promoting community health and safety represent or entail? So with that, we're gonna have some introductory questions that'll allow our guests to speak a little bit more about how they became involved in this work and how the organizations that they represent are moving this work forward. So, and in no order, the first question is, what inspired you to become involved in work surrounding communities and policing?
Corenia, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I don't mind. Yeah, I got involved in this work kind of a couple years ago. I originally started my organizing in reproductive justice. And so that definitely involves communities and policing in the sense that people are trying to create and sustain the types of families they want, and they also have the right to parent in safe environments, and that definitely involves policing. And so in my time in reproductive justice, which has been my grounding, I have a lot of mentors and support and friends who also have been identified as abolitionists. And so it's really been nice as I've transitioned through reproductive justice, becoming a nurse, and now as an organizer with Reclaim the Block, to really tie all of it together because it really intersects and is related. And so I feel like what's been inspiring in all of that has really been the ability to be responsive to community needs, the ability to have a direct impact on people's lives, and the way that we care for each other.
Am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes, Corenia.
Oh, Corenia. Okay, great. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm SooJin, and so, I've been involved in anti-racist work through my work as a professor of race and ethnic studies, as a writer, and as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, and also as an organizer. So I helped organize adjunct and contingent faculty around the Twin Cities to form a union with Adjunct Action back in the day, like around like 2012, 2013, 2014, those years. And like a lot of folks, who witnessed the lynching of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, that event lit a fire in me to redirect my energies and activism and organizing around abolition. And so how did I come to that place? Well, my daughter and I, we spent the summer immersing ourselves in the history of policing in this country. So she ended up taking an online course that was offered by Freedom Lifted in collaboration with the Chicago Freedom Schools and Assata's Daughters. And I did my own self-education. And at that point, I was all about reform. But after educating myself this summer and reading books, articles, listening to podcasts, and attending webinars and teach-ins, I realized that, oh my goodness, the police have had like centuries worth of chances to reform, and they have squashed every single attempt at reform. And I also understood like what the core function of policing has been in our country, thinking about the roots. And so, from all that education, I asked myself at the end of the summer, if I were living during the times of slavery, which side of history would I be on? Like, I fancy myself as an abolitionist. I want to consider myself like I would be on the side of abolitionists. So when I think of myself within the context of slavery, I wanted to align the projection of myself as an abolitionist with the actions that I'm taking in this moment. So if I fancy myself as an abolitionist in the 17th century, well, hey, I'm living here in the 21st century. So like, I need to be an abolitionist in this century. And so that's how I ended up kind of holding myself accountable in this work, because I wanted to, make sure that my values align with my actions. And so I remember that Ricardo Levins Morales who, reached out to me, who actually started MPD150 with some other core activists and community members. And he had reached out to me in 2016 to help with a report. This report, Enough is Enough, that just, we released a new 2.0 version of it. Anyway, at that time, I didn't have the capacity to work with their team on the report, but I did not want to have another opportunity go by and miss it. And so I reached out to him to see if he needed any volunteers, and they did, and I've been involved with them and working with them ever since.
I think in your response to how you became involved in this work, SooJin, you bring up some really important language, reform, abolition, and we can also put in another word, defund. And so what I'd like to do in steering this conversation is have you and Corenia, in the simplest terms, speak about how you define reform, defunding, and abolition, and then we'll scaffold that conversation up a level and think about those terms in our current social and political context. And how do we define defunding, abolishing, and reform in regard to policing? So the first place is just the first part of the question is just in their simplest terms, what's the difference between reform, defunding, and abolition?
Yeah, I can start. SooJin, please feel free to fill in.
No, yep.
I would say that in the simplest terms, reform is measures that give the state power to implement the specific reforms that are being suggested. And they often increase the scope and power of the system that we're trying to dismantle. So typically, you know, reforms are yeah, like saying this is what needs to change, and then putting it also in their hands to say how you implement those changes. And there's often not accountability, and it's often that those things don't happen. And I think of abolition as, you know, as principles, because there's so many different ways that you can embody abolition. There's a lot of different tactics and postures of it. And I think that at the core, I really love the way that Miriam Kaba phrases it as abolition is the elimination of policing, sentencing, and surveillance, and it rejects the expansion of all aspects of the prison industrial complex. So surveillancing, policing, sentencing, imprisonments of all sorts. So it's really anything that reduces the power, legitimacy, and resources of policing. And I feel like right now in terms of defunding, we're really, that also has its own purview depending on the context that you're applying it to in all of our different cities. But I love that defunding is also tied to investments. When people are asking for defunding, they're saying move resources into the things that our community needs. So it's not just defunding in a destructive way, but yes, in some sense, you do have to dismantle something to rebuild the thing that the people are saying that they need. And so it's really investing in our communities and in organizing and in resources that our community says that they need.
Thanks for that, Corenia. So I think of, when I think about the difference between reform and abolition, so that's where I'll start first. There's two analogies that come to mind. You know, I think people are pretty familiar with the analogy like of the foundation. Or like construction, right? Building. So reform in this context or in this analogy is like the foundation is the same, but it's like swapping out the window treatments or upgrading, you know, to granite countertops, like prettying things up, making things more modern, more palatable. But the foundation essentially is the same. Whereas abolition is about recognizing that the foundation is rotten to the core and we need to not only destroy, but then rebuild a new foundation, like what, as Corenia was talking about. Another analogy that I like to use is, I guess it's my, my own personal one. So you know those like carnations and roses like in grocery stores that are dyed to generate petals, right? That are blue, you know, different colors, right? Blue or purple, whatever. To me, this is what reform is to me. Reform is the equivalent of watering a flower with colored water so that it appears like it's a new species or a new variety. But the core function of that flower, the essential makeup of that flower, its DNA remains the same, even though the outer appearance has changed. And abolition, on the other hand, is about uprooting. It is literally pulling up by the roots and planting entirely different seeds that have a completely different function because its makeup, its DNA is totally different. So that's how I see the difference between reform and abolition. And then defunding, as Corenia was saying, is, you know, it's about divesting. It's about divesting funds and resources into something else. And because we all know that when it comes to budgets, wherever the most money is routed to, that is what our society prioritizes the most. And in many cities, the largest piece of the budget typically goes to policing. And so like, and so what we mean by defund is to actually divest from the police and reroute those funds and resources to something else that actually not only prevents, you know, crime and harm, but also nurtures and facilitates public safety, community healing.
Thank you. So would you say that defunding, right? So that divestment is a tool that's used when we're talking about abolition instead of defunding being its own, for lack of a better word, intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. Defunding is a path towards abolition. It's definitely a tool in that sense. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for providing that clarity, because I think in a lot of the conversation and the rhetoric around reform, defunding, and abolition, defunding is presented as something of its own and not as a tool for, as you all say, divesting from the system and using that reallocation to constructively build something better.
Yeah, it's the first concrete step that we can take towards abolition is defunding. So as Corenia was saying, it's a direct path to abolition.
Okay. And that leads us into, I think, a sort of a follow-up question. So we're kind of continuing to scaffold in our building of our understanding of reform and abolition. So how would abolishing or defunding the police work? What does that process entail? And it doesn't have to be this complete street map of how we get from point A to point Z, right? Because I think a lot of how we get from A to Z is influenced by our community stakeholders and helping to inform decisions. But if you could give us maybe some guidance as to what does that really entail?
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely a process, and it's a transitionary process, right? As you are identifying, even doing community engagement, talking to folks that are directly impacted about what it is, what are the basic needs that aren't being met, what are the programs and solutions that need funding, what are the ways that we need to care for each other better and shift the culture, what are the ways that we need to address violence and harm that are happening currently. That it's going to take time, right? It's not something that you implement defunding and it just happens the next day, right? It takes years. This is a years long process for the whole city, right? So it's not something that's that's just happening overnight that I think a lot of people forget. And I think even when people are speaking to the current state of things right now, that we have to remember that the part of the reason why we're in this conversation is because of the violence that the police perpetuate and the fact that they don't actually make people feel safer. And part of that also is that oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought there. But yeah, I'll just I'll just leave it at that. That it's definitely a year-long process in terms of the timeline. Yeah.
Yeah, when you were saying that, it made me think, of the saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. And if you extrapolate that saying to the United States, the institution of racism wasn't built overnight. And overnight, we are not going to just dismantle it, that it's going to be a marathon that we have to commit to in order to dismantle it.
Right. I just did remember my thought.
Okay.
It's just that in the current state of things, as we have the conversations around defunding, that the police department hasn't been defunded currently, right? The police department has a budget and they're operating. And so when people say like, oh, there's long wait times or no one's responding or, all of the retaliation that has happened over the last 6 months, that the police are full, they have their resources right now. Nothing has changed in that sense. So I just also wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, and if I could add, yes, yes, I understand that like this is a long game, right? The project of abolition is years long, and it it may or may not happen in our lifetime. That's not the point, right? Because we're trying to again, if we think ourselves like back during the times of slavery, people were fighting against slavery, even though they probably knew that it wasn't going to happen in their lifetime. So, so knowing that there are things that we can do right now, to push and to leverage this momentum of racial reckoning in our country. And so, for example, you can call your city council people, you can, call your mayor and get them to reduce the budget of the police. In Seattle, they cut it in half. Why can't we do that? Why can't we cut it by half? And incrementally every year, taking a percentage and cutting it by half, by half, by half until it is zero. So that's one tangible thing that we can do and that we could do like within a year. And hold the mayor and our city council accountable when they said that they were going to dismantle the police. They said they were that they were on the over the summer, when they held that community gathering and made those promises to our community. So holding them accountable to that. And then as it relates to abolition, people are living, people have already started planting the seeds of abolition right now. And people have been creating their own systems of safety and how do we respond when harm is committed. Corenia was talking about like transformative justice models. Like people are doing that already right now. So abolition to me is not something that we have to wait for until the police has been dismantled. No. we can plant those seeds of abolition right now and looking at those models that already exist.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you're really emphasizing an important point in taking on the marathon to dismantle structural racism, especially in the form of policing, because we don't get to the end of the marathon just by, saying, yes, I'm going to run this marathon, but we have to go through each and every mile of that terrain in order to reach that end goal of having completed those 26 miles. And so I think people can really sort of take what you're saying, and that we can plant those seeds now, right? Those seeds represent each mile of the marathon, so that one day we, in the future, whether it is us or our children or our grandchildren, will be living in a society in which policing has been abolished, and in its place we have a much more constructive and supportive system that grows our communities and protects our communities and supports our communities. And I want to segue to the next question, which we have touched on this a little bit, but in talking about defunding, one of the questions is, why is it a more constructive pathway towards, or how is, or let me back up and say, when we talk about defunding the police and we're talking about communities, we also have to talk about communities' health. So how or why is defunding a more constructive pathway towards enhancing public health in the community than reforming?
Corenia, did you want to take that first, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll fill in.
Yeah. Okay. Well, defunding is a much more constructive path, because if we think about what are the actual things that prevent harm and crime, it is when people's basic needs are met. So think about the suburbs and think about the inner city. The suburbs are a very highly resourced space. They live as if the police don't exist, right? Whereas in the inner city, it's over-policed, right? And it's very under-resourced. And so if we think about what are the actual things that prevent harm, it's when people's basic needs are met. It's when people have access to affordable housing, to food, to education, to employment, to livable wage. So what if we took, a third of our city's budget and actually routed it to those programs, to those things that actually prevent harm and crime? To me, that is a no-brainer. Why wouldn't we fund the things that statistically show and reveal that these are the actual things that prevent harm and crime, whereas the police, as the budgets continue to balloon, every year police budgets get more and more money. More and more money is diverted to them. And yet, look at where we are in our society. Do people feel more safe now? No, regardless of the millions of dollars that we are throwing at the police. And so, again, as you don't have to be an academic to understand, this very commonsensical thing is we route resources to the things that actually prevent harm and crime, and take away resources from the things that are actually exacerbating violence and death and destruction. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. Corenia, do you want to add anything on to that?
Yeah, I think what I was thinking about was as we're talking about defunding and in public health, that absolutely opens up a pathway for there to be investments into life-affirming institutions and systems. And when we're talking about social determinants of health, right? When we, there's so many things that we know are actual factors and are part of the conditions for why people don't feel safe or why people feel like they need police. And so if we're addressing those things, if we can identify the root causes of some of these outcomes, then why wouldn't we address it, right? And often part of that does have to do with resources. So that's the only thing that I would add.
Thank you. I think you guys supplied a really great answer to that. It's about addressing the root causes, which systemic and structural racism is, and how those structural, how a structural determinant, which is racism, the systems of oppression, right? They create or give rise to social determinants of health. And we can put policing in as a social determinant to community health, in inhibiting the health of the community in the way that we know of policing today. So in sort of further thinking along those lines, right, that we all agree that we need to address the root cause instead of just increasing police presence, and that both crime and health are on that exist within the web of causation that's connected to that root of structural racism. And what are some of the most important aspects of society that we need to invest in? And I know we started to go down here in the previous question, but maybe we can speak to some specific examples of structures, of life promoting structures like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that absolutely, if we're serious about breaking the cycle, that we have to put money into the tried and true programs that actually prevent violence. And some of those are community-based outreach teams that support communities in solving conflict. Some of those are responding to violence when it happens. And in even having like a culture of being able to address violence and harm at the small stages, right? It's oftentimes that we don't address it there that violence escalates. It doesn't just start at the climax that violence happens, right? There's a building up to that. And we have to make sure that we're divesting money and resources from perpetrators of violence. And in some cases, in this case, it is the police. And so part of that too is like funding real mental health solutions, and making sure that there is real affordable housing that has low barriers, that's dignified, and investing in land trusts so that renters have the ability to buy their homes instead of developers. And I think also as this pandemic is raging on, part of that is supporting the residents, right? Having support for substance use and overdose prevention and environmental justice. People need childcare. There's so many unaddressed needs of unsheltered community members. People need direct economic relief. There needs to be worker protections. There's so much, right? So yeah, I think that there's so much that if we even start addressing some of these things, it'll have a snowball effect, because when our community is happy and thriving, that translates to so much more.
SooJin, do you want to add anything?
No, I thought that was great. Very comprehensive. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's sort of the simple principle is taking funding and investing into other agencies that help promote the community's health and therefore the public's health. And in thinking about health from a very holistic definition, not just physical health, right? But that does sort of segue a little bit to another question about funding agencies, or funding other agencies, I should say, in that we know that structural racism, it doesn't represent a single institution, let's say, of police departments or the criminal justice system. And these other institutions that that we have interactions with in our everyday lived experiences, some good, some bad. They are also affected by structural racism. So in moving funding or divesting from policing and investing in other agencies, how do we ensure that we don't exacerbate structural inequalities that exist, that are intertwined with those other agencies? And just for an example, it could be, a health department or an organization that focuses on social work or so.
Yeah. Corenia, did you want to begin or?
Yeah, I can. I would say that a lot of the systems that we have, they're not all foolproof, right? A lot of them, say for instance, like domestic violence prevention organizations, like a lot of them have to be tied to policing so that they're actually able to provide the services to survivors that they need, right? There needs to be a police report. There needs to be this or that. And while we know that people don't want that, because oftentimes the police end up escalating those situations, or, their abuser has already left the scene, so there's not any real resolution that happens from that. But even still, you still need to call them to be able to get funds to replace anything that was broken or stolen or whatever. So I think that part of that has to be like a participatory process, because we don't all have the answers. Not one person has the answers of what is the solution, what is the agency that already exists or doesn't exist that we need to resource. But we do know that there are some that do really amazing work right now, but that don't have the funds to continue to do that, right? We don't have rent tenant navigators. We don't have folks in the recast program. The Office of Violence Prevention does need more funding, and they also need, more guidance in as we're going along this journey of abolition, and as we're talking about ways that people are actually needing more conditions of safety to be implemented. So yeah, I think that that's what I'll say.
I think what I would add to that is, so I can't help but think of Audre Lorde in this moment when Jaime, you're asking, how can we create these systems without reproducing like racism, sexism, all that stuff. And how we can do that is making sure that when we're creating something new, that we create a new foundation that is not built on the master's tools. That we're not using the master's tools. What are master's tools? Divide and conquer, racism, sexism, class, all the different isms, those are the master's tools. So that we don't then reproduce the master's house. So I want to share an example of like how this would look like. So Cahoots is a mental health services, I guess org in Eugene, Oregon. And they're 31 years old now. And this one group has led to the reduction of police violence and death against communities of color and disabled communities in Eugene, Oregon. And why is that? Because they have adopted this principle from psychology that they will approach. This is like a fundamental principle that they operate by, that they approach each person with unconditional positive regard. In other words, receiving every individual that they encounter with complete support and acceptance. Receiving them as if they are not a threat, as if they are not a danger to society. So that is the foundation of Cahoots. Can you imagine if the police had that kind of foundation, if they operated from that principle, what policing, quote unquote policing, would look like in our society? So given that principle, in 2016, 50% of the calls that involved police led to death. In 2017, 17% of the calls were diverted to cahoots instead of the police, which translated to over 24,000 calls. Not a single incident led to death or serious injury in those 24,000 calls. So cahoots has achieved a 100% no-kill success rate with a budget of just $2 million a year, which is the equivalent of 2% of the entire police budget for the Eugene Police Department. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it is possible. It is possible to create new structures, to create new systems that don't rely on the master's tools, that is not reproducing systemic sexism, ableism, racism, etc. And so that is why, again, we need to divert. Like, can you imagine what cahoots would be doing if they got not 2% of the police budget, but 100% of the police budget, right? They're able to have that kind of success rate with just 2% of the budget. Whereas look, I mean, the police department, it's like 50% of the calls led to death. So like, are they effective? No. So why would be investing more and more money towards them?
Right. No, I think you bring up a really good point, or illustration of the cost benefit ratio with respect to us continuing to invest in policing the way that we traditionally have and still currently do. And I think that's important with respect to public health, because we're trying to improve the public's health, but do it in a way that's effective and cost efficient, right? Like, we're always talking about the financial burden or the economic burden or costs that the United States experiences, whether indirect or direct. But we need to really think about or apply that thinking to the current investments that we make, right? So thank you for that. I want to shift.
Can I just add one
Sure.
qualifier? So when I was talking about the percentage of calls that led to death, specifically around mental illness, were the calls, not every single call, not every single 911 call, like 50% of those led to police death. Just want to clarify that.
No, thank you for clarifying that that piece of things. I want to shift the conversation a little bit because we are getting close to the bottom of the hour. And I want to make sure we have time for questions. You all spoke about the tools of the master, right? And one of those tools is fear. And fear is bred out of ignorance. And we know that language matters. And society attaches certain meanings, emotions, social and political meanings to it. And that can either be a vehicle to enhance that fear, right? Or to squinch that fear with placing knowledge on it. And so in essence, these words have weight and meaning attached to them from people who have stakes in each term, right? In the reforming versus abolishing. What are the individual stakes at play when it comes to reform, defund, and abolishing? And what would be the collective benefits associated with each of those? So it's just sort of thinking to maybe simplify the question, language or rhetoric shapes the conversation around reform, defund, and abolishing the police. and it thrives, that rhetoric thrives on our fear and our ignorance. And what we need to consider is that there's individual stakes at play that drive the rhetoric, and there's collective benefits that are not, that are downplayed or ignored with each of those. And so I wanted to have you all speak to some of the individual stakes at play that influence the messaging and our understanding around reform, defund, and abolish.
SooJin, do you want to take this one?
Oh, sure. So I guess, okay, when we think about the cops and their union, the stakes around defunding and abolition are very high for them, right? Because they have lots of self-interest in making sure that the police is around. Yeah. But and the fact that the police are on the side of reform should tip you off, right? That reform is in the best interest of the police and not the larger community. So why would you be on the side of the oppressor in that sense? Not thinking about the police, but thinking about civilians. I see the stakes being very different based on the color of your skin, your economic status, your gender, your sexual orientation, and whether or not you have a disability. So if you're part of the dominant group, white, cis, straight, male, middle class, able-bodied, you typically will be left alone by the police because you're not seen as a threat. You're already living as if the police has been abolished because they're not present in your lives like they are in communities of color, which begs the question, given that you're not harmed either way, with or without the police, why wouldn't you support measures that defund or abolish the police that would improve the lives of millions of people? And if you're not part of the ruling class or don't look like you're a member of the ruling class, then there are huge gains to be made in defunding and abolishing the police. Your quality of life increases. You get to live instead of being murdered or locked up for non-violent minor infractions. So again, for those civilians who aren't negatively impacted with or without the police, why wouldn't you be on the side of abolition in this century? The over-policing of brown and Black bodies and the prison industrial complex is slavery by another name in the 21st century. What side of history will you be on? And on the side of the enslavers or on the side of abolitionists? So I feel like that's really what's at stake here around these terms of reform, defund, and abolition. And what are the collective benefits? Oh my gosh, our world would be significantly more equitable and a much more humane place to live, where the vast majority of people will experience an increased quality of life. When our collective health is healthier, we at an individual level are healthier.
Thank you so much, SooJin. The only thing that I just want to pull out of that juiciness that just landed there is the over policing. So it's not just policing, it's over policing. It's the fact that people cannot escape the interactions, the contact, the exposure of violence that comes from over policing communities. And the other thing that I want to pull out that you just said so perfectly is just that there is the reality of a police-free communities, right? There are communities that don't have these interactions with police. So when we're talking about abolishing, we're talking about expanding those conditions that allow there to be communities that don't have policing. And what are those conditions, right? Some of those are suburbs where people are resourced, where there's transportation, people have the means to their basic needs, they're healthy. So why, yeah, in reality, it's like abolition is not some far-fetched thing that isn't possible. We have—
It's not science fiction.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's really just expanding that to the rest of folks, the rest of the population. So I just wanted to pull that out as well.
Thank you. I think you guys bring up some really good points, and I want to make sure that we get some of the questions in from the audience. Um, I'm going to go to a question that asked about this related to language, right? And getting buy-in from the population as a whole, right? So the question is defunding the wrong word when we're talking about divesting and investing in prevention? Should it be redirecting?
Gotcha. I would say that the reason why we're saying defunding, and I'll try not to make it confusing, right? So as we're talking about defunding, even as we might say we want this amount of money from the police budget, the money that they're allocated, they still have the autonomy and discretion to say how that money is used, right? They can still redirect their own funds to other departments. Not all of it is compartmentalized in this way where those funds can't move and translate. And so I think that defunding is actually the word, and that it isn't redirecting, because when you're defunding, where are those funds going? You're reinvesting them into community measures. And I think, I would say that. And then I also would say that when people talk about defunding and whether or not there will be an increase in crime or safety, there's so much data that shows that hiring more non-white officers does not reduce police violence. Neither does hiring more female presenting officers, who are actually more likely to shoot than their male presenting counterparts. And there was a study actually done in 2016 at the University of Cincinnati that analyzed 60 studies on the relationship between the number of police and crime levels from 1968 to 2013. And the data shows that increasing the number of officers does not reduce crime, and reducing the numbers of police does not increase crime. And so really what they found is that the primary correlation in increased police shootings is not an increase in crime, but actually an increase in Black residents. So as we're talking about defunding, it's really, again, investing in life affirming institutions and systems that allow people to not just survive, but to thrive.
I love that. Life affirming institutions that allow people to thrive. You know, in our own backyard, after the death of George Floyd, we've, you know, both of the organizations that you all work with have really taken on this idea of abolishing the police and or divesting and reinvesting into those life promoting, life enhancing institutions. And one of our audience members has a question, speaking to violent crime. Basically, that violent crime rates are elevated in the city this year. Could one or both of you address the critics who say that redirecting funding away from police could create a gap in which violent crime could increase and public safety could be degraded in the short term, while we are building a healthier, firm foundation of community determined structures? Right, so it's thinking about, you know, we know what our long-term goal is, and while we're working to reach that, there's going to be changes that are occurring in the short term. And one of those could be an increase in violence crime. One of those, it could it could be something else, and it could be something very positive, right? That we have this reduction in violent crime. But in terms of like the short-term benefits and consequences, I think that's what our audience members is trying to get at.
Can I chime in here? Okay, so first of all, there's no evidence that defunding will lead to increased crime. So we need to first dispel that assumption, because that is a lot of people have that assumption that if we take away money from the police, then automatically things like crime and violence is gonna be heightened. And there's no evidence that will happen. Although national crime rates were already on a downward trend in the early 1990s, police budgets all over the nation ballooned since 1995 after the landmark National Crime Bill passed, leading to federal funds being used to offset local and state police departments. So since 1995, US homicide rates have actually dropped by a third. So again, we have this idea that we think that like crime is escalating and things are worse than ever before. It's not the case. I think it appears that way because we have social media and people, civilians are showing like this, what the police are doing. Because for most of that time without social media, they were hiding all the murders, all of their bad behavior. So while US homicide rates have dropped by a third, police spending has increased by 46% nationally. And in some cities, even more than that. So it might be tempting to make this direct correlation that police budgets increased and therefore we have lower crime. But resist that temptation because data scientists, Andy Friedman and Mason Youngblood, they conducted a data analysis of 473 cities nationwide. And they found that police spending does not correlate with crime because many cities spend the same amount of money and have very different crime rates. So cities that allocated more funds to police did not experience more or less crime in any predictable pattern. So I think we need to first dispel that assumption, this equation that people have made in their minds that defunding equals increased crime, because that equation is false and studies prove it.
Thank you so much, SooJin. I think the only thing that I would add is really that documentation, training, oversight. People think that this will protect us from the harassment, intimidation, beatings, and death that folks experience by the state as a way of having social control. And they guise it as safety, right? And that actually isn't what's happening. And so I think that really as we need to recognize that policing is armed protection of state interests, right? Of the interests of the cultural majority. And there needs to be a shift into recognizing that the goal isn't not to improve how policing functions, but to reduce its role in our lives. And so that is really what defunding is getting at. And I'm not an expert on patterns of crime and violence. And I know that none of us have asked for what we've experienced in this last 6 months. But I think that there needs to be some recognition into why that happened, right? That was in response to an egregious murder at the hands of the state. And so, yeah, I think that some of it is nuanced and both of those need to be recognized for what it is.
Thank you both for that, I want to just say, beautiful answer. And I want to just challenge my my colleagues who are trained epidemiologists, or you have methods, backgrounds in you've been exposed to epidemiology, not to make spurious or confounded associations between defunding or abolishing the police and rates of violent crime. Because a lot of that messaging that we have been exposed to has been created to play on our on fears, and it is upon all of us to become more knowledgeable about what is the difference and what between reform, defund, and abolishing, and what the individual stakeholders and collective stakeholders are associated with each of those aspects. And then I want to thank our special guests for joining us and sharing their knowledge with us, as well as their passion. I don't think anybody can walk away saying that our two guests are not passionate and not committed to seeing policing abolished and investing our resources into life promoting and enhancing institutions. And then lastly, I want to just recognize Gabby Horsford, who is a master's student in our program, in our Masters of Public Health program here, for organizing this seminar. And I want to just say that I'm really proud of her and the work that she's doing and the commitment that she has shown with respect to policing and community health. So thank you, Gabby, for bringing us all here today. So with that, Gabby mentioned that she has been taking down, or she took down all of the questions that were asked. So I'm sure that we will connect up with everyone, or connect, Gabby and I will connect to kind of look through what questions that we weren't able to fully get through during our hour. And I also want to make sure that just to remind you that for further reading, you guys can check out an expanded report that was put out by MPD150. The link, there it is. I will definitely be checking it out and educating myself on this, because I want to make sure that my mind has a buffer against messaging that is for to promote messaging that is to protect self-interests and not the interests of our collective society. So thank you, everyone. Sorry.
Yeah. I would just wanted to add that there's also an audio version. The MPD 150 report is kind of hefty, so the audio version is also really helpful. And thank you so much, Jaime. Exactly like you're saying, education allows us to be able to discern our discomfort from safety or fear. And so I think that that's really critical. And thank you so much for having me today.
And if I could just say one thing before we go. So I wanted to share this quote from Mariam Kaba in Hope is a Discipline podcast. She said, "Abolition includes dismantling prisons, policing, and surveillance in our country. But the real project of abolition is to create the conditions where those things don't need to exist in the first place." That's real abolition, where we don't need that stuff anyway, because we're all collectively, mutually caring for each other. So thanks everybody for being here and for inviting me to this panel.
No, thank you. I mean, thank you for providing us with that quote. I mean, just think about it. Everybody just kind of close their eyes for a moment, just one minute, and think about being in a society in which there are no jails, right? There's no need for jails, a prison system, policing system, right? There is, there's community resources that promote social capital between neighbors, between individuals who live in community with institutions that take care of community.
How can you not want to fight for that instead of making do with what we have right now? Like, that is such a better future, a better present. Like, I mean, just even, imagining, right? Or that simple exercise of imagination, my whole body just like felt less stress, relaxed, happy and joy filled my spirit. I'm like, yeah. Why wouldn't we fight for that?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're fighting for. So just, every time you need to remember, just take a moment and think about, what would it feel like if I was in that society? And also remember that it doesn't have to be a dream, and it doesn't have to be something that's part of the imagination. It is something that could be real if we commit to it and invest in that idea. So with that, I wanted to just say thank you again to all of our panelists, to Gabby for organizing this, for our attendees who supplied really great questions. And if you have a chance, for those of you who are faculty and students, please make sure to go to the link and fill out the evaluation form. So thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.